there's some really good questions that have come through, and one of them actually concerns the New York gradual emancipation statute and why men had to wait an extra 3 years than women to become free.
You know, I'm not 100% sure on that. I think that there are a couple of reasons to think. There are a couple of ways that I might think about that. I think that I can imagine colleagues who would have a clearer answer than I would. I'm thinking of two possibilities. One is that slave owners were reluctant to give up the valuable labor of enslaved people. And enslaved men were understood and were thought to be able to work harder and longer for more of their lives than enslaved women. And so it's just one way to think about that is like it's a perk for slave owners. Another way to think about that is recognizing, I wonder if the law might have been recognizing the realities of childbirth and child rearing practices, and the possibility that by age 25, women would be more likely to be responsible for children. And so it could also be seen as the emancipation at age 25 might also be seen as a boon or a benefit to enslaved women who might be freed and then be able to raise their children in freedom. But I honestly don't know. And I thought about that and I didn't have a chance to look it up.
No, I think those are both great theories. I thought about the first one for sure, that you would think they would just want to, it was kind of a self-serving law. Yeah.
I think that broadly, so I think that gradual emancipation generally is partly, the reason why it's gradual is partly because slave owners and white Americans were generally anxious about how Black people would live in freedom. There was this theory that, among other theories, there was a theory that because enslaved people weren't in charge of making decisions in their day-to-day lives, that their like moral compasses were underdeveloped, that they didn't know right from wrong because they always had a slave owner telling them what to do. Which there's so many falsities in that idea, right? Fundamentally, slave owners aren't always telling enslaved people what to do. The institution of slavery doesn't work that way. So that's one of the sort of anxieties that led lawmakers to say, let's just gradually emancipate people and see what happens. But there's also, of course, the fundamental reality that like slaves were valuable property, and slave owners were reluctant to part with them.
Yeah, and so just kind of a follow-up question has come through, kind of explaining the mechanics of gradual emancipation. What is the eventual end date? So if a child is born to an enslaved woman who's presumably enslaved, and then they add like another 25 years, you know what I mean? Like in these statutes, how did it end?
Yeah, so you're getting at one of the sort of realities here, which is that enslaved people might be enslaved for decades after these kind of gradual abolition laws were enacted. And that was the case in a lot of instances. In Pennsylvania, there are a handful of enslaved people well into the 1850s, still listed on the census record. But New York actually enacts a measure in 1827 that says all enslaved people are freed at this point. And so there is in some cases this happens, and this happens also in the Caribbean islands, the colonies of Great Britain. There is like a gradual abolition act, and then there's a decision that's like, you know what, let's just end it and say that all people are free. So in some cases, there were moments where lawmakers said, all right, everyone is free. But then in other cases, there were still these sort of lingering enslaved people. There are enslaved people in New Jersey, and I want to say in Vermont, there's like one or two enslaved people still on the books when the Civil War starts.
Really? Wow. Well, that's incredible. So another good question. So there was African American men had some benefits of citizenship in the early republic. How did neighboring states react to that, or how, what was kind of the situation, between states where one would have different laws than the other?
Sorry, different laws in regards to?
In regards to emancipation. And so, I guess we could think about this question in terms of how African Americans might have responded to different laws in different states? And then, you know, are there any documents that sort of outline, you know, these differences and how people reacted?
Yeah, so I can actually think about examples for both ways. So New Jersey enacts a law that says that enslaved people will gradually be freed from that state. And one of the responses of a large number of slave owners in New Jersey is to sell enslaved people to other states. So not always to neighboring states, but to sell them into the deep South. And so it's a way to sort of skirt the law. It's like, I don't, you know, slave owners don't want to lose the value of their enslaved people. And so they're sort of benefiting from laws that operate differently. And then New Jersey enacts a further measure that tries to prevent that. In terms of African Americans, one of the things that I think is really interesting is that statement from Pittsburgh from 1831 that I talked about, where the Black men are demanding the right to vote. In Pennsylvania in 1831, Black men legally were allowed to vote. Black men weren't deprived of the right to vote in Pennsylvania until 1838. And so I actually think that they're writing that not only as an argument for themselves, but also as an argument for folks in a place like New York, where the laws are restricting Black voting rights, where Black men are not entitled to the same opportunity, to equal opportunity to the vote as white men are. And so I think that there's definitely among Black Americans an awareness of how the law is working in other places, because, you know, like a law can easily become a model. If New York says Black men can't vote, Pennsylvania lawmakers they know that. And maybe some will be motivated to enact a similar measure in Pennsylvania. And so there's always folks who are on their guard about what's happening in other places because they know how ideas travel.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's really interesting. While you were talking, I was also thinking about the example of own a judge, and when you get the differences between, you know, states that have slavery and those that don't, and as you mentioned, that's the Dred Scott experience too, moving to a place where there's freedom.
The Dred Scott is all about Tawney trying to say slavery belongs to the nation, and no state laws restricting slavery are legal.
Yeah. Maybe we'll end with this question, because this has come up in some of the other sessions, and I think it'd be really great to hear your thoughts about this. How might we apply these principles that you've been talking about with early American citizenship to our political situation today, with movements like Black Lives Matter? And I'll just tack on a little thought that I had while you were doing your presentation. I really saw the 1619 Project come through, which I think is often misunderstood. And one of the points of that project, I think, is that Black Americans, it's not that they haven't been patriotic, they've been extraordinarily patriotic, the most patriotic Americans, you might say. And I kind of saw that in the examples that you were giving as well.
Yeah, there's a way to think, there's a couple ways to think about that. One is that to build on your point, Denver, that I think African Americans have long been and have sort of described themselves as the defenders of American ideals. It's like, if this nation is defined by freedom and defined by equality, then the best way to actually show that is to provide freedom and equality for people who have once been enslaved. And so I think that the folks that I'm writing about, or that I've written about and that I've talked about today, are really deeply invested in this ideal of the United States as like living up to what the Declaration of Independence says. And I think that in a lot of ways, that's what contemporary struggles for racial justice are getting at, is like, we need to continue to make the nation a place of equality, the nation a place where like people are actually given equal access, and where people enjoy rights as birthrights if they're born here, right? I think another way to think about this is some contemporary resonance is right there in that sort of issue of birthright, right? Like citizenship was contested in the 19th century. Citizenship remains contested now. There are lawmakers advocating for an end to birthright citizenship, and there are always contests over like what exactly citizenship entails. Some people say that when people argue that healthcare is a human right, part of what they're saying is that this is a right that's to which citizens should be entitled. This is a thing that the government should provide. And so there are all these arguments that are being made from various parties about what citizenship should mean. Like, what are the legal terms of our relationship to this nation? That's the enduring question.
Yeah, absolutely. And our previous presentations have kind of been on the American Revolution and the aftermath. And one thing that we basically said that we're still settling this, right? We're a young country. Yeah. We're still living in the legacy of that event and determining what it means.
Yeah, the early United States survives.
That's right.
It's still early.
It's all. That's right. It's all. That's one way we can battle our colleagues or the modern Americanists. That it's all early American.
It's all early. Yeah.
Terrific. Well, why don't you talk a little bit about the document?